So just to introduce you, Helen's had over 25 years of experience working in heritage and conservation in the private and the public sector. Worked as a conservation officer, worked as an English heritage inspector, and is going to talk to us today about the challenges of reusing vacant listed shops. So exactly leading on from Ian's presentation about some of the particular challenges for our historic buildings. So thank you, Helen. Sorry we're running a few seconds late.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. I never quite know because I've got a split screen, so I sometimes we end up looking at different things. But anyway, one of the things I wanted to I've had some really interesting conversations with Ian over the last sort of 6 months, and one of the things that he's explained to me, which I'm not sure kind of massively came out in his presentation, but perhaps everyone else picked up on it, but I'll just reiterate it, is that it's generally one of the big problems is that it's no one's responsibility. So I'm interested that people are saying, but what about planning? You know, I'm a planning officer, what can I do? And what about enforcement? And they're answers that we have for slightly different questions. And until it's someone's responsibility, it seems to me that it's always going to be really hard to make progress, because it's not quite a planning issue, and it's not quite an enforcement issue, and it's not quite a conservation officer's issue. But all of those people have some of the tools to unlock these problems and to move things forward. So I just wanted to sort of to just mention that before I started. So Nell's asked me to talk about particularly listed buildings and heritage issues and the particular challenges that they bring when we're thinking about the reusing of vacant listed shops. So I'm just going to run through some you may already know the answer to this, you may have heard this before, but I'll just run through it so that we're all on the same page. So the first question is, why are listed buildings different? And they are, of course, different because they're protected by law and under policy, because they have historic features which contribute to our understanding of place and history, because these features enable us to understand the past and they provide a unique character for the present and the future. They're very often one of the main reasons that we love individual places. They're valued by the public and they help to reinforce local distinctiveness, which is also beneficial for healthy high streets. However, they are a finite resource, and once gone, they are of course gone forever, and that's recognised in law and policy. So the next question is, why do they become vacant? And of course, the reasons for vacancy are as varied as the buildings themselves. And Ian's very well articulated point about understanding the backstory to every building applies just as well to this. It's just the answer will be slightly different in terms of them being listed. And what makes them special to us can also make them seem, or perhaps be, difficult to reuse, especially in the absence of clear and bespoke advice. As has already been mentioned, they are likely to cost more to repair or fit out. The specialist repairs in terms of things like lime plaster or lath and plaster and things like that, it is more expensive, there's no question about that. So whilst they're sort of fundamentally quite adaptable spaces, the demolition and rebuilding may be more attractive economically, and developers may think that leaving them vacant may increase the chance of this. Note lots of mays, because of course, as Ian says, you have to understand the backstory, and it may be that that's not quite the case. But I think in some cases that is what people think, that if they leave them to fall down, you know, they may be able to redevelop the site. It really seems to me that this point that I made to start with about the fact that we're all saying, is it you know, I've got planning, you know, tools available to me because I'm a planning officer. What role do I play in this? I'm a conservation officer, I've got heritage policy at my disposal. What role do I play in this? It seems to me that so often everyone's actually talking past each other. The landlord, the lessee, the council, and sometimes the conservation officer are not really forming the partnerships that we've been hearing about as being kind of critical to the success. So why do they stay vacant? Again, this comes back to understanding the backstory, but it seems to me that it's around these issues: difficult trading conditions, lack of incentives, buildings falling into disrepair and then that cost potentially spiralling, significance not understood. Now that's a really key thing that we're going to come back to. Sometimes the planning system actually assists in them remaining vacant and the planning and conservation system rather than helping. And there may, of course, be other units which are easier to reuse. And it seems to me that what could glue all these things back together is specific and bespoke advice, which is geared towards reuse. So let's look for a minute at heritage protection. If you're going to make a listed building consent application, it seems to me that as a basic, you need to understand what the process is that you're entering, how it works, and what other people want out of it. And that's the same whether you're a large-scale developer in a town centre or whether you're a residential household owner who wants an extension to their listed building. You have to understand this. And more often than not, when we're asked to come in and kind of help sort out a problem, it's because people don't understand this. They don't understand the process that they're going into. They don't really understand how it works. And they certainly don't really understand that there's a kind of push and pull and that other people want something specific out of it. And in particular, it's really important to understand what the conservation officer both wants and needs to have in order to be able to determine the application and how to present it to them in a way which actually resonates with them. People also need to understand what the policies are and how they might begin to satisfy them with their own specific development. And in heritage terms, this all starts with an understanding of significance. Now, significance is a word that I seem to use about 50 million times a day, although I still can't spell it. And it's worth just looking at what is significance. So significance, which, I mean, you know, I've been around long enough now to remember all the different words that came before significance, but significance, and we might refer to it as heritage value or special character, is what makes a building or a place unique or valuable or important or cherished, or perhaps might contribute to an academic understanding of what is interesting in heritage terms about a place. So it's a sort of it's a monster with many different faces, I suppose. Is it a monster? No, it's a nice thing with many different faces, but they all sort of amount to the same thing. And in trying to use these different words like unique, valuable, important, cherished, academically interesting, I'm trying to get to the idea that there is a general consensus of what is heritage importance or significance. Understanding significance is key to unlocking the listed building consent process. And therefore, understanding significance and correctly explaining the impact of proposals on significance is the absolute key to unlocking the reuse of any listed building, but specifically including vacant shop units. So one of the things that Nell asked me to talk about is what can you do to a listed building? Now, this is a vexed and tricky to answer question, but I will try and run through it. It's not really possible to answer what you can do to a listed building outside of a discussion of significance. And I'll give you an example of that. As a company, we've done a lot of work in Covent Garden, where most of the buildings are listed, not all of them, and it is in a conservation area in central London. Now, Covent Garden was developed from the late 17th century onwards, with significant alterations and improvements as the first leases fell in, so about 100 years afterwards. So we've got lots and lots of kind of later 18th century buildings. Now, some of those buildings are remarkably pristine, actually, given their location. Some of them are in poor condition or were in poor condition. So and some of them have been very, very altered to the point where they've sort of been rebuilt behind a retained facade. So walking down the street, you can't really tell from looking at the outside which ones are really good inside and really unaltered and which ones are actually lots of concrete and steel beams. So in the ones which have been very altered, it's always easier to get listed building consent for further alterations, particularly to the upstairs floors if there's not very much historic fabric left. But in the ones where you go in and there's 18th century staircases, some of them really beautifully carved, there's 18th century paneling, all that sort of thing, it's going to be much harder to you know, the council are not going to want to see the loss of those features, quite understandably. So the only way that you can understand what you can do to a listed building is to understand what makes it significant. But it has to be said, and you need to bear in mind that what would be considered a sort of standard alteration to a normal, in inverted commas, building would need listed building consent, and it may not be granted. For example, as I was just talking about, the removal of his important historic features, including windows, internal walls, fireplaces, staircases, floorboards, ceilings, plain lath and plaster, so not even necessarily, decorated plaster surfaces, but plain lath and plaster, chimneys, chimney breast, all that kind of thing, are likely to be resisted because these contribute to the significance and the understanding of the building. So changes must respect and retain what makes a building historically interesting and important. And now that I've seen all this slide up, I've realised that I haven't begun to answer the question about what you can do to a listed building, because you sort of can't really. Upper floors are obviously, a really big issue, and even where there's reasonably high occupancy rates on the ground floor, the upper floors are very often either underused or completely vacant, and that's even given that about, someone will correct me on the dates here, but I think it was about 25 years ago, English Heritage introduced a scheme called lots, living over the shops, and it was about, as the name suggests, trying to get more residential occupation on the upper floors of historic towns and cities, and it was quite successful. But even in the wake of that, there's still lots of underused and or vacant space in our towns and cities on the upper floors. And as a result of that, they're very often in quite poor condition. So it's really common. I mean, I live quite near Chipping Norton, and I can think of a really good couple of examples where the ground floor shops are used. That's fine, that's no problem. But you go upstairs and they've got really, some, in one case, a 17th century decorated plaster ceiling, which is or was falling down. Because of this sort of lack of use, and also I suppose a lack of investment, they can often be quite historically interesting, and you can find some really great features on the upper floors. But it seems to me that it's reasonable and indeed important to bring them back into viable economic use. Although I've seen examples of where this has happened, and then the shop unit has struggled for storage and staff rooms. But you have to bear in mind that the same listed building consent restrictions would apply, and alterations need to be brought forward in the context of what's significant about these particular spaces. But of course, it's possible to think about residential use, additional commercial floor space, or a separate commercial unit in some cases. But bearing in mind, if you need a separate entrance, that's something that needs to be sort of considered very carefully. So I'm just going to now look at a handful of examples of work that we've done. I think they're mainly Oxford and Oxfordshire. So this is a former NatWest Grade 2 listed on the High Street in Oxford. It's actually just up the road from our office. And the photograph has cleverly been taken such that there's a bus in front of the ground floor windows on the left-hand side. Vacant listed banks are a big issue. They're very often like this. They don't really have a shop front. They've got great sort of banking fit outs inside, which can make them quite difficult to use and all the rest of it. Anyway, this had become vacant and had been vacant for, Ian will probably know the answer, I can't remember how long, a couple of years at least. But originally this was actually 2 units. It was built as the bank on the right hand side and a music shop on the left hand side. And in the 1950s, some sort of plain kind of Gothic style windows to match the rest of the building were put in and the shop front taken out. So the proposal was to reuse the ground floor as a rather smart kind of restaurant, and to reuse the upper floors as flats. And really the proposals had sort of become unstark mainly because there was a lack of understanding about what the original shop front may have looked like. So the proposal was to replace these 1950s windows that are behind the bus with a nice shop front. But there was no real understanding about what the original shop front looked like. There was also no understanding about what the original layout of the upper floors was, and therefore when the conservation officer was being asked, can we take this wall out, the answer was, well, I don't know, what's the significance of that wall, and nobody, it's difficult to get hold of the answer. There were also specific things like, where was the stairs from the ground floor to the first floor in the bank, and also the applicant was sort of would quite like a lift, but nobody could kind of figure out where the best place to put it was. So the way that we approach this is the way that we approach all of our projects, which is to undertake detailed research into the history and development of the building. And in doing that, we were able to uncover plans from the 1920s. So whilst it was still a music shop and a bank, which showed how the upper floors were laid out, where the staircase was. It gave us an indication of where a lift could be kind of sensibly accommodated. And then we had to do some kind of quite intense research to find some photographs of the shop front, which we eventually did, which gave us a really good idea about how to replicate the missing shop front. And it's not exactly as it was, but it's not a bad sort of replication. So that was, I mean, again, the unlocking of this building for its commercial reuse hinged on being able to understand and explain its significance. This building is actually opposite the one that we've just been looking at. It's a very, very complicated building, as you can probably tell by looking at the outside of it. Underneath all that kind of render and stucco, there are timber frames. There's a jetty on the right hand side, which you can sort of tell by the brackets holding up the first floor. The bit that we're looking at is mainly grade 2 star listed, but across the site there were grade 2 listed buildings. It's all in the conservation area, so there are curtilage listed buildings. There's unlisted buildings that make a positive contribution to the conservation area. The cellars are 13th, 14th century, and throughout the site there's 17th, 18th and 19th century fabric, which is all of significance. Now this is one where understanding the significance of the building was really important to the work that was done to the upper floors, but sad to say the pub on the ground floor still doesn't appear to have taken off. And I think there's more work to be done to understand why that is and what can be done about it. But certainly in terms of understanding the significance, that work has been done, so that as and when an application is brought forward to refurbish the pub on the ground floor, it seems to me that that could be done fairly confidently in the framework of an understanding of the significance of the building. So this one is sort of ongoing. This is, I mean, Burford in West Oxfordshire was voted about 10 years ago, I think, as being one of the most desirable places to live in the whole of Europe. And it really is a very beautiful Cotswold wool town. Even in Burford, there are too many vacant shop units, and there are too many units which have opened and then failed. And I've included this picture. This is actually the upper part of the hill in Burford, and you can see the variation of amazing buildings. So lots of these are medieval behind their facades. They're very often redressed in the early and mid 18th century with fantastic kind of vernacular approximations of little country houses. The one on the far left is a sort of miniature country house on the hill in Burford. However, there are so many applications that come forward in Burford where there is no understanding of the significance of the fabric. And the building that we were working at was sort of 1, 2, 3 on from the right hand side. So it's got a projecting shop front. And that application was brought forward, and there were lots of questions about, well, we want to take out this wall. Well, what is it? We don't know. So we were brought in to give a really thorough and bespoke appreciation of what is significant about that building. And actually, that building and the 2 units which are houses now on the to its right are formed together what was a medieval hall house. So until you understand that that's a medieval hall house which was split in the 18th century into I think actually it was originally split in the 18th century to 2 houses, and then in the 19th century it was further split into 3 houses. Until you understand that kind of evolution, it's always going to be sort of borderline impossible for the conservation officer to be able to say whether or not something's acceptable. So what is the main challenge, or what are the main challenges? It seems to me that the kinds of retailers that we really want in places like central Oxford and in places like Burford are the niche, local, artisanal ones. They don't understand heritage significance, and why would they? If it comes to that, the Bootses, the Waterstones, the kind of major, they don't understand significance either. And again, why would they? But it's specifically the ones that I think we really want to attract. Many people, find the planning and heritage process labyrinthine, expensive, opaque, frustrating, and slow. That's not meant to be a criticism of the people who are operating that process, but that is certainly what I find as a consultant using these services, sometimes I can't explain to my client why it's taken a year for the local authority to come back to us and say that they're going to refuse the application. You know, that's really, really difficult situation to be in. Listed units are definitely more challenging and more expensive to reuse. There's no question about that. But also there seems to me to be no go-between or honest broker between the conservation officer and the potential end user. And I sort of like to position ourselves as exactly that. It's trying to make sure that the conversation which is currently going past everybody is actually engaging with people. So what is the potential response? It seems to me that alongside the need for retail unit vacancy to be someone's, i.e. someone's specifics problem, there's a need for an upfront understanding of the significance and historic fabric of all vacant listed retail units in a given area, an audit, if you will. And because this falls between the parties, it should be, in my opinion, commissioned by the public sector and supplied to the potential end user to resolve this problem. We're talking about public sector investment in something which benefits the public in the long term. And we need to acknowledge that these buildings cost more to develop, but contribute more potentially to the high street because of their inherent cherished local value. And things, you know, grant schemes like HAZ play a key role in bridging the funding gap. But is it possible for councils or anyone else to do more to bridge this funding gap? And that's it from me. Hopefully not too controversial, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was really interesting. And at the moment, we don't have any questions in the chat. And I would like to.
Oh dear.
Just say, well, some usually questions come a little bit.
We do have, there are questions in the chat.
Oh gosh, am I missing them completely? Thank you, Helena.
Yeah, so I think Charles is kind of agreeing with what you just said, and he says, my experience of getting engagement from planning, heritage and building control has been slow, contradictory and not focused on facilitating clear guidance, which has often frustrated progress on bringing buildings back to use. How can this be made more user-friendly?
Can I just duck in and ask the question, Helen, are you able to stay for the whole seminar? Is that okay? Just thinking
I can now.
Timing.
Yes, originally I couldn't, but now I can.
Well, that would be great. So if you just want to comment on that, and perhaps then we can revisit some of these comments.
I think the question was, how do we make that process sort of more straightforward and less frustrating? It seems to me that it's likely to be more straightforward and less frustrating if you understand what everybody is trying to get out of the process. So obviously planning, conservation and building control are all trying to do slightly different things. So there needs to be somebody who can understand what those slightly different things are and bring them together. Now, the problem is, whose responsibility is it to do that? Is it my responsibility as a heritage consultant? Well, I mean, I can do some of it, but I can't do the building control side of it. Is it the council's responsibility? It seems to me that what you need is an old-fashioned town centre manager who stands between the different parties to say, okay, well, I hear what you want. However, the main aim here is to get this building back into use. So if we understand significance and if we can meet as far as possible planning policy, and if we can do as much as we can in terms of building regs, the main aim here is to get this building back into use. And I think that there, in my experience, both in the public and the private sector, there's a lot of silo thinking still.
Thank you. I think there's a number that would agree with you there. And I would just like at that point, following on from Helen's sort of call for better understanding, we at the Towie Centre have been in a very fortunate position to be able to develop a lot of training courses, a number of training courses, which you can see advertised through the Towie Centre website. And they include heritage impact assessments, so writing those to help understand how to bring out the significance of a building, and also listed building consent, talking you through the process of those. So
I mean, I could talk all day about writing heritage assessments, and I won't because it's not the right forum, but I agree with you, and the standard is pretty low in the sector, and poor quality heritage assessments are accepted all the time. And what I want to say to people who are involved in validating those applications is every time you accept a poor quality heritage assessment, you know, you are doing nobody a favor. They have to be done properly, and they have to be done in such a way as they make sense. You know, it's just you cannot make a decision unless you understand what's significant about the building. So my view is that local authorities with a particular problem with vacant listed units should commission this work and have it done up front. There should be a little mini statement of significance for every vacant listed building in a particular area, so that the niche, so that the cheese maker and the person who, I don't know, makes their own shoes and sells them or whatever, has that information, they have that understanding, and they can say, oh, okay, so I'm not, you know, I wouldn't get consent to knock that wall down. That's fine, we can work around that. You know, they
And they
have to
know
have
that
this. They have to have it
upfront.
up front, and the
Yeah.
only way to do it is to get somebody to look at these buildings and say what's significant about them now, rather than wait for that to come out of an application.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, Helen. That was really, really interesting and helpful. And I know that there will be more questions, and as they tie in with previous and speakers moving as we move forward after the break.